This video is brought to you by Skillshare, an online learning community for creators with thousands of classes in design, business, and more. Skillshare is giving away 2 free months of premium membership to help you explore your creativity. If you click the link in the description below, that's for the first 500 people only. More on them in a bit. In February 1865, an Augustinian friar stood up before a small crowd in the Moravian city of Brno and delivered a lecture that changed the course of history. For the last 8 years, Gregor Mendel had been cultivating peas in his abbey's garden. Each plant had been carefully selected for its characteristics, like tall or short or yellow or green, and then painstakingly crossbred to create generations of hybrids. The result was not just a shed load of peas, but a whole new science. It was from Mendel's notes that the entire concept of genetics sprang, a branch of biology that would fundamentally change our understanding of the world. But here's the kicker. No one would realize what a breakthrough Mendel had made for another 35 years. At the time he delivered his lecture, Gregor Mendel was middle-aged, anonymous, and virtually unknown outside of Brno. In his lifetime, he'd travelled little, experienced less, and mostly just lived in his abbey. Yet somehow, this nobody single-handedly made one of the greatest discoveries in history. Today on Biographics, we're delving into the life and the mind of Gregor Mendel and discovering how this one monk transformed our world. Of all the branches of science, genetics may be unique in that it can be traced back to a single person. But if your vision of a man so brainy he can uncover whole new sciences is some wild-haired Rick-style genius lording it over the simpletons around him, prepare to be disappointed. Gregor Mendel wasn't just a modest man. He came from a background so modest he nearly didn't study science at all. Born Johann Mendel on the 22nd of July, 1822, young Mendel was the son of farming parents seeking out a living in the Silesian foothills in modern-day Czech Republic. At that time, this was still a part of the Austrian Empire, one of the great powers of Europe, and Mendel grew up speaking German. But since nearly every location in our story has long since lost its German name, we're just going to use the modern Czech names when referring to places. That way, if you want to look stuff up later, you'll actually be able to find it, and also I'll do a whole lot better job pronouncing it. For Mendel and his parents, life in remote Silesia wasn't exactly easy. The family was always teetering on the edge of financial catastrophe. And Ma and Pa Mendel harbored no great dreams for their son beyond having him grow up and help run the farm. That may very well have been Mendel's fate, had it not been for one man. When Mendel was aged 11, the village priest, who also doubled as the local schoolmaster, came to the family farm asking for a meeting. There, he told Mr. and Mrs. Mendel that their son was exceptionally bright, indeed alarmingly so. In fact, the schoolmaster said Mendel was so clever that he should be allowed to continue his education. Now, this wouldn't exactly have been music to the family's ears. In the Austrian Empire, sending a child off for secondary education often involved paying fees that most families just simply couldn't manage. While Mendel's parents weren't dirt poor, they also couldn't afford to spend crazy money on something as nebulous as learning. But the schoolmaster insisted, and eventually the family caved. And so it was that in 1834, Mendel left his village for the first time and went to study in Opava. For the gifted country boy, life in industrial Opava wasn't exactly what you'd call enjoyable. In a real city for the first time, Mendel failed to fit in or adapt to the pressures that he felt to succeed. He frequently fell ill, plunging into deep, dark depressions that would keep him from studying for days. It was the first flicker of the disease that would come to haunt Mendel for his entire life. But those black days were still in the future. Despite the strain at school, Mendel graduated in 1840, having excelled in his studies. In fact, he did so well that his parents allowed him to continue to university in Olomouc. A small, beautiful city amid the rolling hills of Moravia, Olomouc is less than 70 kilometers from Opava, but must have felt like a world away. Gone was the industrial detritus of Silesia, replaced by clear air and Baroque majesty. But even such Instagram-ready surroundings couldn't stave off Mendel's black thoughts. While at Olomouc, Mendel's mental health came close to total collapse. Twice he had depressive episodes so deep that he dropped out of his math studies, slipping back to his disappointed parents. Both times, though, he eventually recovered enough to return to Olomouc. But even then, money worries left him badly overworked, forced to tutor alongside his studies just to make enough money to eat. But he made it through. In 1843, Mendel graduated. His parents must have breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, their son was coming home. But home was the last thing on Mendel's mind. Depressed as he'd been in Olomouc, he still wanted to study. He just needed a way to do so without any financial pressure suffocating him. Luckily, in the Austrian Empire of the mid-19th century, such a way existed. One of the strangest things about Mendel's life story is just how much of it was made possible by other people. At every important moment, there was someone there to push him in the right direction. Someone like the village schoolmaster. Someone, too, like Abbot Cyril František Knapp. An Augustinian, Knapp deeply believed in the creed dictum per scientium ad sapientium, which means from knowledge to wisdom. As head of the abbey in the great industrial city of Brno, some 60 kilometers from Olomouc, had devoted his life to building a center for study. He supported his monks in scientific endeavors, helped them get university placements without paying fees. For Mendel, this was exactly what he needed. In 1843, he joined the order, taking the name Gregor. For the rest of his life, Mendel would be based in Knapp's Abbey in Brno. And speaking of Brno, it's time we got to know the place that Mendel called home. The Czech Republic's second city, Brno today has a reputation for being pleasantly boring, the sort of place where life is a steady procession of Sunday afternoons. Back in the mid-19th century, though, it was an industrial powerhouse, a multicultural center where vast German, Czech, and Jewish communities rubbed shoulders. From this melting point would spring minds such as Ernest Mach and Kurt Gödel, or musical talents such as Leos Janáček, someone else whose talent was spotted by Abbot Knapp, by the way. In short, this was the exact right place at the exact right time if you wanted to change the world. Not that Mendel had any inkling of his destiny just yet. In fact, his first years at the Abbey seemed almost to be a mistake. Part of Mendel's duties after being ordained was to visit the sick and dying of Brno to offer them comfort. But country boy Mendel found the booming city so overwhelming and the lives of the poor there so sad and squalid that he started to crack apart. In 1849, he had another breakdown, this one plunging him so deep into the black ocean at the bottom of his mind that it took nearly a year for him to recover. Thankfully, Abbot Knapp was super enlightened where mental health was concerned. He gave Mendel space to recover and then quietly assigned him to a much less taxing job teaching in the much less frantic nearby town of Znojmo. For Mendel, this seems like the perfect combination. He didn't just recover in Znojmo, he flourished. Sadly, though, it wasn't meant to last. In 1850, the Austrian Empire suddenly shook up its education system. Teachers could no longer teach just because they were clever and needed work. They now needed a qualification to set foot in a classroom. And you can probably guess what happened next. The strain of the exam caused Mendel's nerves to come back, leaving him unable to continue teaching. At this point, it must have looked like the young man was destined for nothing more than a life of battling his illness, with only the occasional ray of sunshine breaking in to keep him going. But Abbot Knapp thought differently. The following year, 1851, he encouraged Mendel to enroll at the University of Vienna, which was just opening brand new courses on science. It seems the abbot hoped to give Mendel something to focus on, to distract him from his problems. Instead, he wound up handing Mendel the keys to his future. Now, you might not be heading off to Vienna to pursue science, but there is no reason you shouldn't improve your skills and keep learning, whatever stage you're at in your career or your life, and that's where today's sponsor, Skillshare, comes into the picture. Now, unlike some websites where you have to pay for individual classes, with a premium membership from Skillshare, you essentially get unlimited access to all of their classes, so you can take as many as you want. Whatever you want to learn, go check out Skillshare. You'll be able to do it on there. I'm someone who will just jump into a particular part of a class. I'll be like, I want to learn that specific thing on that specific topic. Now, if I didn't have unlimited access to all of the classes, I'd have to pay for that whole class just so I can watch the one bit that I want to watch. That's not how it works with Skillshare. You just pay a fixed fee per month. Unlimited access. It's sort of like the buffet of online classes. Now, I've talked about some classes I've taken before, and I'd still recommend those. I took a class on email productivity from Alexandra Samuel, and I took another course on just building good habits with Thomas Frank. Those are both solid, definitely worth checking out. Anyway, join more than 7 million creators learning with Skillshare. Skillshare is giving away 2 months of premium to help you explore your creativity if you just click the link in the description box below. That's for the first 500 people only, but after that, it's still super affordable at only around $10 a month. So check that out, there is a link below, and let's get back to the video. If Gregor Mendel thought Opava and Brno were big, we can't imagine how he must have felt when he first saw Vienna. The capital of an empire that stretched all the way from the Alps to the Carpathians, 19th century Vienna was one of Europe's greatest cities. Under the new emperor, Franz Joseph, it would soon grow to become a cultural and artistic powerhouse. But if Mendel found the sprawling, multi-ethnic city overwhelming, he never showed it. His 2 years studying in the capital passed calmly, without a hint of the mental strain that had accompanied such moves before. Maybe the difference this time was that Mendel was able to get fully involved in his courses rather than worrying about how to make money in order to pay for them. And what courses they were. Mendel studied experimental physics under Christian Doppler of Doppler effect fame and practical biology under Franz Unger. Although forgotten today, Unger was a leading light of Austrian biology in the 1850s, and his closest equivalent is Richard Dawkins. Unger was a huge proponent of the pre-Darwinian evolutionary theory of hybridization, which rejected church doctrine in favor of a natural, if incorrect, theory of how animals evolved. Naturally, this made him a huge hate figure among the devout, and Unger spent the entire period he tutored Mendel fighting off attacks in the popular press. Yet for all of the flack that Unger caught from the hardcore religious, he doesn't seem to have repulsed the monk Mendel at all. In fact, he appears to have inspired him. The year after he graduated and returned to Brno, 1854, Mendel approached Abbot Knapp with a plan. He wanted to run a hybridization experiment in the abbey, likely the biggest the world had ever seen. At the time, there was a huge disconnect between what was theorized about hybrids and what practical experience told you. The orthodoxy was that an animal was an animal and it didn't change no matter what. So if you had, say, a Labrador and a poodle, they might produce one hybrid offspring, but future generations would revert back to being separate species. But that didn't tally with the lived experience of animal breeders who were like, well, dude, look at all these Labradoodles, where do you think they come from? What was needed was someone with time and patience and mathematical training to investigate this problem across thousands of specimens and multiple generations in order to figure out exactly what was going on. Someone like Gregor Mendel. Initially, Mendel wanted to run his gigantic experiment on mice, but perhaps realizing that experimental genetic research and things with teeth sounds like the setup for a terrible horror movie, Abbot Knapp refused, which is how Mendel came to settle on the thing we know him for. Peas. Starting in 1856, Gregor Mendel spent 8 years breeding different types of peas and meticulously recording the results. By one count, he bred and analyzed over 30,000 separate plants. If that sounds like an extremely boring way to spend the best part of a decade, well, no arguments there. But the effect it would have would be anything but dull. In a short time, this one monk working in his garden was going to overhaul everything the biologists thought they knew. If you're wondering now why nobody had bothered to do this research before, well, you're not the only one. Mendel himself seemed flabbergasted by the lack of scientific interest, writing that no one has concentrated on the number of different forms that appear among the offspring of hybrids. No one has arranged these forms into their separate generations. No one has counted them. But there may have been a good reason for that. The work Mendel undertook was almost painfully tedious. The first stage was for Mendel to select varieties of peas to cultivate. He wound up choosing 7 types with binary characteristics that were easy to detect. For example, tall or short, yellow or green, and so on. This was important because people looking into hybrids pre-Mendel had been all like, well, okay, these are all way different, let's crossbreed them and kind of just see what happens. But Mendel's scientific training made him more rigorous. He only wanted to crossbreed those with opposing characteristics, at least at first. So that meant making sure the tall plants bred with the short ones, that the yellow ones bred with the green ones. It must have been insanely fiddly work, the sort of work that would make most people question their choices in life. Yet Mendel kept it up. He kept it up across 8 whole years, across uncountable generations of pea hybrids. And slowly, patterns began to emerge. Let's take flower color as an example. One of the varieties Mendel worked with was pea plants that flowered either white or purple. Mendel noticed that when he crossbred them, the next generation of plants all had purple flowers. It was almost like the whites had never existed. But when Mendel took those hybrids and kept right on breeding them, something interesting happened. In the subsequent generation, white flowers reappeared. Not many, but roughly around 25% of the new generation of hybrids. It was from this observation that Mendel's greatest work was born. We don't want to get too far into the weeds with this. We're a history channel, not a science channel, but we'll give you the bare bones version of Mendel's conclusions. The first was that certain traits are what he called dominant, like the purple flowers in our example, while others are recessive, like the white flowers. These traits were passed down at random from parent to child. The second was that these traits were all passed down independently of other traits. So, just because a white flower trait was passed down didn't mean that a tall plant trait necessarily came with it, or whatever. Mendel's third and final insight was that you could graft a basic statistical framework onto this to predict what traits might show up across the population. It was from these key conclusions that the entire idea of genetics would eventually be born. Not that Mendel realized this. Although he theorized his findings could be applied to any living thing, he seems to have repeatedly missed the implications. In 1862, for example, he read Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species without ever twigging that their work could be combined to explain so much about existence. Yet Mendel wasn't so unworldly that he just kept his findings for the Abbey. He still wanted to tell people about his work. It's just a shame that when the time came, no one was listening. In 1861, Gregor Mendel had co-founded the Natural Science Society in Brno. Conceived as a place to discuss new ideas, as well as an outlet for any work its like-minded members did, the society soon became a key part of Brno's intellectual life. It also gave Mendel a useful place for revealing his breakthrough. That revelation came on February the 8th, 1865. That cold evening, the society converged on a building in central Brno. There, as the freezing members huddled around the stove, Mendel gave the first of 2 presentations on his findings. The title was Experiments in Plant Hybrids, and it ran to a mere 47 pages written down. It wasn't designed to be ostentatious, but it was revolutionary. It seems those attending knew it too. Mendel's 2 lectures became the talk of Brno's scientific circles, yet for some strange reason, word never spread beyond the Moravian capital. It wasn't for a lack of trying. The society published Mendel's lectures as a book in 1866 and sent reprints to libraries across the empire. They even sent a translated version to Charles Darwin in England, but Darwin simply did what everybody did with Mendel's book. He just put it to one side and forgot all about it. The trouble was, it just appeared so boring. I mean, great, a book on breeding peas, thanks! Even those that did read Mendel's work often came away thinking it was applicable only to the vegetable garden. So it was interesting if you were a horticulturalist. It didn't help that Mendel refused to promote his own work, seemingly resigning himself to not being understood. He told a colleague in 1866, "I knew that the results I obtained were not easily compatible with our contemporary scientific knowledge." But perhaps the biggest reason Mendel's work fell into obscurity was loss. In summer 1867, Abbot Cyril Knapp passed away, aged 74. It was a real blow, not just to the abbey itself, but to Brno as a whole. With one of the great intellectual lights of the city gone, the friars looked desperately for a replacement, someone who could take over from Nab. They found their man in Gregor Mendel. In 1868, Mendel became abbot of Nap's old abbey. It was a great promotion, the sort of life the poor farm boy from Silesia could never have dreamed of leading as a younger man. Unfortunately, it was also a life crammed with responsibilities. With no free time left, Mendel abandoned his scientific pursuits. His P's were forgotten, his lectures discarded from his mind. And that was it for the rest of his story. It feels cruel to skip over a whole 16 years of a man's life like that, but really, there's nothing much for us to say. From the moment he became abbot, Mendel did nothing of note. He got older. His eyesight failed, he contracted Bright's disease and lived in some pain, and he spent the last years of his life fighting the Austro-Hungarian state over new taxes levied on monasteries. When he finally died on January 6, 1884, he was remembered not as a scientist, but as a familiar face around Brno. Nothing more, nothing less. If people had been taking bets on his name being remembered in over 130 years' time, you would have got fantastic odds. Sometimes, a long shot comes in. It would take decades more, but Mendel would eventually become famous. Curiously, the one person who seems to have been certain Mendel's name would live on was Mendel himself. Before he died, he wrote to a friend, "My scientific studies have afforded me great gratification, and I am convinced that it will not be long before the whole world acknowledges the results of my work." He soon turned out to be more right than even he could have guessed. The rediscovery of Mendel and the start of his influence on the world came about in 1900. That year, 3 separate scientists all separately published work on hybrids that was suspiciously similar to Mendel's. We say suspiciously because even today, no one's quite sure what happened. The official story is that Hugo de Vries, Carl Erik Correns, and Erich Cheshmark von Seysenegg all declared they'd made a breakthrough, only to be astonished when proof was found that Mendel had done the same decades earlier. However, there's evidence. Each of these men may have read Mendel's book prior to their research and may have independently decided it was exactly obscure enough to steal without them being noticed. Regardless of how it happens, though, their papers made the scientific community turn back to Mendel's work for the first time in 34 years. And what they found blew their minds. It was clear to people living in the 20th century that Mendel had hit on something big. One of his new acolytes, William Bateson, even coined a name for what Mendel had studied: genetics. In no time at all, Mendel was all the rage. While the serious scientific community turned its nose up at the new science for several years, more breakthroughs soon made the field respectable. With that, Mendel's legacy was secured. Today, Gregor Mendel is remembered as the father of genetics, the man from whose work everything in the discipline springs. Incredible as Mendel's work is, though, what's more incredible may be that it happened at all. Looking back across his life story, we can see that Mendel was one of those people history seems destined to completely pass by. His life was so sheltered, so anonymous, that even the biggest events of the day barely touched upon him. I mean, this guy lived through the 1848 revolutions. We've done enough 19th century videos by now to know that anyone who lived through 1848 had their lives changed by it. But not Mendel. He simply kept on working at the abbey, tending to the gardens, just as he did when Prussia invaded Brno in 1866, just as he did when the Austrian Empire transformed into Austria-Hungary a year later. It says something when a man can pass through history while leaving such little mark on it. It makes you think, who's to say there's not another Gregor Mendel out there right now, utterly anonymous to all but the members of one little society in the minor city he lives in, beavering away at research that will one day utterly transform our lives. The story of Gregor Mendel, then, is not just the story of one man and his P's, it's the story of how ideas persist, how great breakthroughs can survive even when the mind behind them dies in obscurity. Gregor Mendel is rightly famous today. Who the next Mendel might be and what life-changing research they may be doing, well, that's something we will have to wait and see. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do smash that like button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Also check out our fantastic sponsor, Skillshare. They are linked to below. And thank you for watching.